There's a particular kind of shame that comes with a messy house. It's different from almost any other kind of struggle because it happens in private, behind a closed door where almost no one else ever sees it. Friends assume you're fine. Coworkers see someone who seems put together and capable. Meanwhile, at home, dishes pile up in the sink for days. Laundry stays in baskets instead of drawers. Surfaces slowly disappear under things that were only meant to be set down for a minute. For a lot of people, this gets written off as laziness, poor discipline, or simply not caring enough. But psychology tells a very different story, one that has almost nothing to do with motivation in the way most people think about it, and almost everything to do with how the brain processes overwhelm, energy, shame, and control. Today we're going to explore 10 real psychological reasons some people genuinely cannot keep their house clean, no matter how many times they promise themselves this weekend will be different. It's worth pointing out right from the beginning just how common this really is. Surveys on household habits consistently show that many adults describe their living space as more cluttered than they would like, regardless of their income, education, or profession. This isn't a struggle limited to one type of person. It affects successful professionals, devoted parents, hardworking employees, and people who are otherwise responsible in every part of their lives. That gap between looking completely organized on the outside while feeling overwhelmed at home is exactly what this video is going to explain. It's also important to understand how demanding it actually is to maintain a clean home. Housework isn't just one task, it's dozens of ongoing systems happening at the same time. Dishes, laundry, floors, clutter, trash, and countless small responsibilities all compete for the same limited time and energy left after work, relationships, and everyday life. For someone who is already emotionally or mentally exhausted, that constant workload can make housework feel less like a series of small jobs and more like one endless, impossible project. Before we dive into the reasons, it's important to remember one thing. A messy house is not automatically a diagnosis, a character flaw, or proof that someone doesn't care. For most people, chronic messiness happens because several different factors overlap. Mental health, brain wiring, personality, and life experiences all work together in ways that are different for every individual. What nearly all of these reasons have in common is that they create a gap between wanting a clean house and actually being able to keep it clean. From the outside, it may look like someone is choosing not to clean, but inside there's often a struggle that nobody else can see. The first reason is depression, and it is one of the strongest psychological explanations researchers have found. Depression doesn't only affect emotions, it also affects behavioral activation, which is the brain's system for starting everyday activities. When this system slows down, even simple tasks like wiping a counter or starting the washing machine can feel incredibly difficult, not because the person doesn't care, but because their brain has far less energy available than usual. Depression also changes the emotional reward people receive from completing small tasks. Cleaning the kitchen might have once felt satisfying. During depression, it often feels emotionally empty, making it much harder to stay motivated. In this situation, the mess isn't proof that someone doesn't care. It is often visible evidence of an invisible lack of mental energy. Clinical research consistently shows that depression reduces self-care, including housework, personal hygiene, and meal preparation, alongside emotional symptoms like sadness, hopelessness, and loss of interest. Unfortunately, another problem quickly follows: shame. A person sees the dirty dishes and immediately feels guilty for not washing them earlier. That guilt creates even more emotional weight, making the task feel even harder to begin. Mental health professionals often describe this as a depressive cycle. The mess creates shame. The shame drains motivation. Lower motivation creates even more mess. Each step quietly strengthens the next. The second reason is executive dysfunction, which is especially common in people with ADHD. Researchers, including psychologist Russell Barkley, have spent decades studying how executive function controls planning, starting, organizing, and completing everyday tasks. Cleaning a room requires far more mental steps than most people realize. You have to notice the mess, decide where to begin, break the task into smaller pieces, stay focused, and finish what you started. For someone with executive dysfunction, any one of these steps can become a major obstacle. Many people with ADHD also experience something often described as object permanence problems. Items that are placed out of sight can be genuinely forgotten. That is why many people keep important objects visible on tables, counters, or chairs, because putting something inside a drawer can feel like losing it completely. From the outside, this may appear careless, but the underlying cause is a difference in how attention, working memory, and executive control operate. Many people with ADHD describe standing in the middle of a messy room, desperately wanting everything to be clean, but feeling completely stuck because they cannot decide what the first step should be. Some ADHD specialists even suggest that visible clutter sometimes becomes an unconscious memory system. Keeping objects where they can always be seen helps compensate for difficulties with remembering things that are stored out of sight. The third reason is perfectionism. At first, this sounds surprising because perfectionists are often associated with spotless homes. But for many perfectionists, the standard for cleanliness becomes so high that starting feels pointless unless there is enough time to clean everything perfectly. This creates what psychologists call all or nothing thinking. If they cannot deep clean the entire kitchen, they may decide there is no point cleaning just one counter. As a result, the house stays messy, not because they dislike cleanliness, but because they care so much about doing it perfectly that partial progress feels like failure. Psychologists distinguish between healthy perfectionism and unhealthy perfectionism. Healthy perfectionists appreciate steady progress. Unhealthy perfectionists often feel that anything less than perfect simply doesn't count. Without the satisfaction that normally comes from making small improvements, there is very little motivation to do just a little today. Instead, they wait for the perfect day when they finally have enough time, enough energy, and enough motivation to clean everything all at once. For many people, that perfect day rarely arrives. The fourth reason is decision fatigue and task overwhelm. Cleaning a house is never just one task. It is hundreds of small decisions made one after another. Where does this belong? Should this be thrown away or kept? Should I wash this now or later? Which room should I start with? For someone who is already mentally exhausted from work, caregiving stress, or everyday responsibilities, those constant decisions become overwhelming before a single object is even moved. Psychologists studying decision-making have found that when an activity requires too many choices, people often avoid starting altogether. The problem is not physical effort. The problem is the mental effort required to decide what to do first. This is why highly structured cleaning systems often work much better than vague advice like just clean a little every day. If a system simply says, start with the surface nearest the door, set a timer for 10 minutes, and stop when the timer ends, almost every difficult decision has already been made. Many people who struggle with cleaning discover that once someone else creates the structure, they can work surprisingly well. That suggests the real obstacle was never laziness, it was the burden of making countless decisions. The fifth reason is something researchers sometimes call mess blindness. Our brains are designed to notice change, not things that stay the same. When clutter builds up slowly over days or weeks, the brain gradually adapts until it stops treating the mess as something urgent. It is similar to how you eventually stop noticing the sound of a fan or the smell of your own home. That is why a visitor may immediately notice clutter while the person living there honestly feels that everything looks normal. They are not pretending, their brain has simply become accustomed to the environment. Psychologists describe this process as sensory adaptation. The brain naturally gives more attention to new information than to things that remain constant. Unfortunately, clutter usually appears little by little instead of all at once. One useful strategy recommended by professional organizers is taking a photograph of the room. Looking at a picture often helps people see their space with fresh eyes because it interrupts the brain's normal adaptation process. The sixth reason comes from childhood and family experiences. Some people grew up in homes that were always cluttered. Mess simply became their normal environment and nobody ever taught them different habits. Others experienced the exact opposite. They grew up in homes where cleanliness was controlled by strict rules, fear, or constant criticism. For some of these people, allowing a little mess in adulthood becomes an unconscious way of escaping the pressure they experienced as children. From the outside, both people may have messy homes, but the psychology behind each situation is completely different. There is another childhood pattern that is also important. Some people learned that associating cleaning with conflict, every untidy room led to arguments, punishment, or emotional tension. As adults, cleaning itself can trigger feelings of anxiety without them even realizing why. Avoiding housework is no longer about the task, it becomes a way of avoiding uncomfortable emotions connected to old memories. The seventh reason is a personality trait rather than a mental health condition. Psychologists call it low conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is one of the five major personality traits in the Big Five personality model. People with lower conscientiousness usually prefer flexibility, spontaneity, and living in the present instead of structure, routines, and long term planning. This is not automatically a weakness. In fact, a study published in Psychological Science found that people working in messier environments often produced more creative ideas than people working in perfectly tidy spaces. That does not mean clutter causes intelligence. It simply shows that for some individuals, a relaxed attitude toward order is part of their natural personality rather than a failure of discipline. The eighth reason is learned helplessness. Psychologist Martin Seligman first introduced this concept after discovering that repeated failure can teach people to believe their efforts no longer matter. Imagine someone who has tried over and over to maintain a cleaning routine. Every time they finally make progress, illness, work stress, family responsibilities, or unexpected problems destroy that routine again. Eventually, the brain begins expecting failure before the effort even starts. The person stops trying not because they want to live in a messy home, but because experience has convinced them that nothing they do will make a lasting difference. This pattern is especially common among people living with chronic illness, unpredictable schedules, or long-term caregiving responsibilities. The encouraging news is that learned helplessness can also be reversed. Seligman's later research showed that small successful experiences gradually rebuild confidence. That is why psychologists often recommend starting with one tiny, achievable task instead of trying to clean the entire house in one day. Each small victory reminds the brain that effort really can produce results. Little by little, those victories begin replacing hopelessness with confidence and momentum. The ninth reason moves into more clinical territory. It is called hoarding disorder. Hoarding disorder is officially recognized in the DSM-5 and is very different from ordinary messiness. People with this condition experience intense difficulty throwing away possessions regardless of their actual value. The problem is not simply collecting too many things. The real challenge is the emotional attachment connected to those objects. Many people feel genuine anxiety, sadness, or even grief when they imagine getting rid of an item. Researchers Randy Frost and Gail Sticchetti found that many possessions become symbols of memories, identity, comfort, or safety. That is why telling someone with hoarding disorder to simply throw everything away rarely solves the problem. In many cases, forced cleanups create severe emotional distress, and the clutter eventually returns because the underlying psychological struggle was never addressed. The 10th and most serious reason is Diogenes syndrome. This condition usually affects older adults and involves extreme self-neglect, severe domestic squalor, and social isolation. It is often linked with cognitive decline, untreated mental illness, or profound loneliness. For most people, this condition is very rare. However, it reminds us that difficulties with housekeeping exist on a spectrum. At one end, there may be occasional overwhelm or missed cleaning routines. At the other end, there are serious mental health conditions that require professional support. Understanding the spectrum helps us replace judgments with compassion. So what actually helps once we understand that this is not simply laziness? Psychologists consistently recommend starting much smaller than most people expect. The first goal is not creating a perfectly clean house. The first goal is simply breaking the cycle of avoidance with one small completed action. It is also important to address the real cause behind the mess. If depression is the problem, then treating depression matters. If ADHD is the problem, then improving executive function becomes essential. If anxiety, perfectionism, or childhood experiences are creating resistance, those issues also deserve attention. Cleaning advice alone often fails because it only treats the visible symptom instead of the hidden cause. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: the condition of your home does not determine your value as a person. A messy room does not mean you are lazy, irresponsible, or broken. For many people, it simply reflects an overwhelmed brain carrying more than anyone else realizes. There is another pattern worth mentioning. External structure often succeeds where willpower alone fails. Some people clean more effectively when another person is simply present in the room. This is often called body doubling, and many people with ADHD report that it helps them stay focused and motivated. Others benefit from setting very short timers instead of attempting hours of cleaning. When success is measured by completing 10 minutes instead of finishing an entire room, the task feels far less overwhelming. Some people also choose one small area, such as a kitchen counter or an entryway table, as their daily reset point. Keeping just one space consistently clear creates visible progress without triggering exhaustion. These simple strategies work because they reduce decision fatigue, perfectionism, and avoidance while creating small victories that slowly rebuild confidence. It is also important to remember that none of these 10 explanations mean a messy home is permanent. Executive dysfunction, learned helplessness, perfectionism, and even perceptual adaptation can all improve with the right support. Therapy, medical treatment, environmental changes, and compassionate habits have helped countless people regain control of their living spaces. The purpose of this video was never to excuse unhealthy habits. It was to replace the inaccurate story of laziness with a more truthful and compassionate understanding. When we understand the psychology behind the struggle, we stop blaming ourselves and start looking for solutions that actually work. If any of these 10 reasons sounded familiar, remember that you are not alone. There may be a real psychological explanation for something you have silently blamed yourself for over the years. If this video helped you understand yourself or someone you care about, let us know in the comments which reason resonated with you the most. And if you enjoy research-backed explanations about human behavior, psychology, and everyday life, make sure to subscribe and join us for more videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.